A wonderful wallow in nostalgia now on BBC 4, celebrating over 30 years of storytelling on Jackanory.
I'll tell you a story.
Of Jackanory.
And now my story's begun.
I'll tell you another.
Of Jack and his brother.
And now my story's done.
Once upon a time, in the days of black and white television, a children's programme was born. It featured some of Britain's biggest stars, and eventually it became a broadcasting legend.
I was very pleased to be on Jackanory because what struck me about it was how good the presenters were. I think Jackanory was like the cherry on the cake of all the other things that I've been doing, you know.
It is one of the things in my life that I'm most proud of.
In 1996, Jackanory vanished from our TV landscape. Yet it's still held in deep affection by the children and adults who watched it. What was it that made Jackanory so special? So, are you sitting comfortably? Then we'll begin. Our story begins in the 1950s, when children were captivated by the stories that unfolded on the immensely popular radio programme Listen with Mother.
On the beach, great seals lay basking and kept time with lazy heads.
At the time, the most popular children's television programmes, including Muffin the Mule, Bill and Ben the Flowerpot Men, and the Wooden Tops, avoided telling stories. But in the early 1960s, that changed, when a former Listen with Mother producer, Joy Whitby, switched from radio to television. She devised a programme that was intended to appeal to preschool children, and included a daily story as part of the format. This new show was Play School.
Hello, I'm Virginia.
Hello, I'm Gordon.
It seemed important to get in and attract people of great quality who might not want to spend all their time doing children's programmes, but who would certainly commit themselves to some performances. And in a way, that's what happened with the storytelling element.
Hello. I'm going to tell you the story of the Little Red Hen.
Play School stories worked so well that Joy was asked to develop another programme for a 15-minute tea time slot on BBC One.
It became obvious that storytelling, which was anyway something I was particularly keen on, should be our intent. And the great challenge was to go above 5-year-olds and to try and reach the 8 to 11-year-olds, which was Jackanory's target.
To deliver the series' initial 6-week run, Joy Whitby recruited 2 key personnel, Anna Hume and Angela Beeching. They became the backbone of the operation. The very first story was a fairy tale called Cap of Rushes, about an impoverished girl who enchants a prince. Broadcast at 5:15 on the 13th of December 1965, it proved perfect for the tea time audience.
Hello. Every day this week, I'm going to tell you a different story.
And you have to bear in mind that at tea time, there's likely to be a great eavesdropping audience. And I felt what was necessary to give this storytelling some kind of glamour was the involvement of people from the mainstream whom the adult parents would recognise. And there was a very charismatic actor called Lee Montague that I'd noticed in adult drama, and he was intrigued by the idea.
There was once a very rich gentleman, and he lived in a castle with a lot of fine lands. He had 3 daughters, whom he loved very much.
I was never told a story when I was a child. I don't think there are any books in the house. I come from a long line of tailors in the East End, and I think the only book that we had was Pear's Dictionary.
Did you make my broth? Asked the young man. Yes, I did, young master. "Where did you get this ring?" asked he. "From him who gave it me," said she.
The first run also featured Hattie Jakes reading Mary Poppins and Wendy Hiller, who read Little Grey Rabbit. The formula was disarmingly simple. An actor was recorded in a studio reading stories throughout the week. But this experiment in TV minimalism was an instant hit. Straight after its 6-week trial, it was recommissioned to run every day, all year round. Sadly, in the 1960s and 70s, tapes of many editions were wiped, including several classic readings of Aesop's fables, fairy tales by the brothers Grimm, and the now outdated Gollywog stories by Enid Blyton.
We were looking for a mixture of traditional and new, fantasy and reality, humour and seriousness, myth, legend. We were trying really to reflect as broad a possible spectrum as we could of available children's literature of the time.
With astonishing speed, the series established itself as a TV institution. Just 3 months after its debut, Jackanory's star readers were interviewed about the series on the highbrow cultural discussion programme Late Night Lineup.
Is this a new departure, reading stories for children on television?
Yes, it's the first time I've done it at all. I was terrified, really.
Why?
No, because it was a new phase of work for me. And I think television is always rather terrifying, you know.
James Robertson, Justice, does reading stories on Jackanory require different technique from acting?
I would be quite incapable of answering that. I put myself in the very, very capable hands of the director and try and carry out what she tells me to do.
At first, some stars had been reluctant to present the programme, but within months, the big names were queuing up to take part.
At that time, it was a bit of a cult thing, really, to be asked to do it. And, of course, you'd obviously seen it, so you were quite thrilled when they said, "Would you like to do Jackanory?"
Like most of their readers, Bernard Cribbins was established as a celebrity by the time he made his first appearance on the show in 1966.
I'd done my funny records, Right Said Fred, Hole in the Ground, so I was known to children, as it were. I'd also done, I think, 2 carry-on films. So from that point of view, children knew about me. So it was sort of a progression to get into Jackanory. I think the opportunities for a show-off actor, enormous.
Though the format was very straightforward, the producers had little access to editing facilities, which meant that readers needed to record their stories in just 1 take. That could prove challenging for the actors and stressful for the production team.
I used to give them terrible frights by sitting there singing Fat and Airy with the mic on. "Shut up, we're going." "Right, sorry." "Hello," and we'd be off, you see.
Jean and Peter went out one day with their dog, Scamp. They ran into a meadow and Scamp broke free of his lead. He ran up towards the end of the meadow. Then they saw a castle with St. George's flag above it.
Bernard Cribbins was the most frequent visitor to the Jackanory studios. He presented 111 episodes, though his fans couldn't get enough of him.
Bernard Cribbins was an absolute spellbinder. Some people are good readers and some are not, and he was just a brilliant reader. Almost anything that Cribbins did seems to have worked. I can't remember ever watching Cribbins thinking, no, he's getting this wrong.
He didn't like to run till he was on the other side of the door, and then he bounded down the stairs and out through the main entrance to his taxi. He noticed Palgrave and Dr. Antonio standing in the forecourt, scratching their heads. "Birds found, gonna get the bread bin," Mr. Jones panted as he ran by.
I think one of the reasons that Bernard Cribbins was invited back was that he was so versatile. He could do all sorts of different kinds of stories.
The series also attracted many unlikely recruits from the world of adult comedy. Spike Milligan and Dudley Moore appeared, as well as Alan Bennett, one of the leading figures in the cutting-edge satirical review show Beyond the Fringe.
"Yes, bless you, little, yes. Botty booze."
I don't think I had the cosy image that I supposedly have now, which I always found rather irritating, but nevertheless I'm landed with. They may have thought, oh, here's a mild, unthreatening presence, I think.
One day, when Pooh Bear had nothing else to do, he thought he would do something. So he went round to Piglet's house to see what Piglet was doing.
My normal mode, I would have thought, was slightly off-putting, really, to children. So I had to make some effort to soften the edges a bit, really. Otherwise, they probably switched off straight away. We don't want him.
The Jackanory team tried to make the experience less burdensome for the big stars by loading their scripts onto autocue.
I think if you'd had to learn the lines, then you wouldn't have done it because they wouldn't have paid you enough. It would have taken you weeks to learn a whole book. The autocue took a bit of getting used to at first, but once I'd done it a couple of times, then I fell in love with it. I thought it was a marvellous thing because it meant I could work directly to the centre of the camera, which was a child sitting there. And you just isolated one child in your mind and told the story to that child.
But the autocue was not without its drawbacks.
On one occasion, as it was scrolling down, I found myself scrolling down even further and actually beginning to drop off.
I mean, you can sometimes tell when people are using the autocue by just watching the eyes going backwards and forwards, so you try and move your head a bit and occasionally just to keep that secret.
From the outset, Jackanory's producers considered it their mission to introduce children to a wide range of literary experiences.
I had a very strong feeling that there was a whole treasury of stories which children of that time were not really getting access to, accepting often in rather garbled versions.
The staple components of the Jackanory diet included works by Britain's favourite children's authors, including A. A. Milne, Kenneth Grahame, and E. Nesbit, author of The Railway Children.
I genuinely got excited and, suspenseful while I was reading them myself because they were so good. I remember in particular, for instance, the scene in The Railway Children towards the very end when her father comes home and Roberta is standing on the platform and sees this figure through the steam, the misty steam of the train, and slowly realises who it is and says something like words to the effect of, "Daddy, it's my daddy." It almost makes me tearful now reading it, it's so brilliantly written.
Oh, my daddy! My daddy! That scream went like a knife into the heart of everyone on the train. People put their heads out of the windows to see a tall, pale man and a little girl clinging to him while his arms went tightly round her.
As well as presenting children's classics, Jackanory tapped into the publishing boom of the 1960s and thereby introduced young viewers to a new generation of children's writers, including Helen Cresswell, Roald Dahl, and Nina Borden.
"It's gone," she said. Do you mean someone's stolen it?"
Nina Borden, she is a true novelist in the classic style, but her children and the situations in which they find themselves are very contemporary, and I think that was what was attractive.
Emerging British writers were joined by international authors in Jackanory's repertoire. In 1968, the series helped to popularise the Pippi Longstocking books by the Swedish writer Astrid Lindgren. These were first read by Joyce Grenfell and a few years later by Patricia Routledge.
I remember reading the book and the script and imagining what she looked like. Little girl, cheeky face, freckles, red hair, plaits. And when we actually recorded the stories, the daughter of the authoress was with us. She came over from Sweden, and she brought the original illustrations, and Pippi was exactly as I'd imagined her.
We would deliberately do stories for younger children 1 week, and then a novel the next week, and then we'd do something that was every child would enjoy, particularly the comedy ones. They loved the comedy stories.
In Jackanory, the BBC had found the perfect mix. It was a genuine rating success that remained true to the values set up by Lord Reith, the founding father of the BBC.
I think you can, in all fairness, you can say and you can see that Jackanory comes out of that, directly out of the Reithian tradition, to inform, educate and entertain, all of which it did, I think, at its best.
I think children's television at that period was imbued with Reithian principles, and the whole idea of educating in the broadest possible sense was right at the root of children's broadcasting, including Jackanory.
Ostensibly, Jackanory appeared to be custom-built according to the strictest Reithian principles. But the show's creative leader hadn't designed it with its public purpose uppermost in her mind.
Jackanory wasn't set up with any particularly educational purpose. It was set out because we wanted to tell stories because we loved stories ourselves, and when you like something yourself you want to share it. That was what made it work, not any sort of deep psychological purpose.
From its earliest days, Jackanory was picture book television. It relied heavily on the use of illustrations, created by a small team of BBC in-house graphic designers. Jackanory's demands were insatiable, and so for the designers, the pace was relentless.
I think what it was a sort of illustration factory, really. And so we were under real sort of pressure to create, literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of illustrations in quite short space of time, really.
They had to do one a day, every single day. But artists being artists, of course, they were not like that, so there'd be huge deadlines that they didn't meet and so on. But they were always done by the time we got to the studio.
When we got the scripts, we'd open them trepidatiously to see how many battles, wedding feasts there was, and go, oh no, there's 2 wedding feasts and a battle in this one.
I remember Joy Whitby once calling up and saying, could somebody come down to the studio because you've drawn a horse here and its penis is just a little bit too big and we've had a discussion about it, and could you come and take about ½ an inch off it? We were trying to create old masters, I think.
Exactly. Yes. Trying to create a Vermeer for sort of the little dog lost.
So, and I think we kind of made a rod for our own back. I think if we'd known how it was going to go on, we wouldn't have started doing it that way.
As the designer's workload became almost intolerable, the producers turned to freelance illustrators. One was Quentin Blake, who'd already earned a reputation as one of Britain's most inventive illustrators.
I think the people who were working on the staff were doing pictures that would last forever and could be looked at for a long time. But I used to think, they're only going to see this for several seconds. Whoopee!
His pictures were so quirky, and he was able to put over such a lot in just with a little dot.
Quentin Blake became one of Jackanory's most popular illustrators. He worked on more than 150 episodes, including Joe Nacon's Arabelle and Mortimer series. So successful were his drawings that in the 1990s, the BBC created a new puppet series based on his original work. Ironically, Jackanory never invited Blake to illustrate stories by Roald Dahl, even though he'd collaborated with the author on book projects for many years. But Jackanory did offer Blake a starring role on the show, telling stories of his own.
Quentin Blake was so good at illustrating that we gave him a piece of paper. It was like a giant lavatory roll, I suppose, in the studio. And he drew a story as he went along about a little fellow called Lester, little creature. And he used to tell these stories, and they were very popular.
Hello. The story I'm going to tell you today is called Lester and the Wibbly Wobbly Business. But first of all, you need to know about Lester. Now, I'm not quite sure what he is, but he looks like this.
I got so involved in the idea of telling stories in pictures, that I think I thought I would like to do it myself. I mean, Lester was a sort of dragon that looked a bit like a dog, and it had to be something you could draw very quickly, and again and again.
Here's Lester showing him how to do touching your toes. Actually, Lester probably wasn't the best person to choose to do it because he's not really very good at that sort of thing. He's not quite the right shape.
Quentin Blake's delivery seemed fresh and spontaneous, in part because he was unable to use the autocue.
I was facing the drawing and I couldn't read from autocue, and I think it would have been too difficult to be staring around like this. So in a sense you had to learn it all by heart. And of course the words had to keep pace with the drawing, and you had a pretty good idea of how long each drawing was going to take, but you couldn't be quite sure.
And Lester and Lorna helped him to collect the fivepences and thought about how very interesting it was to have a wibbly-wobbly business.
Quentin Blake wasn't the only storyteller to narrate and illustrate their own stories. In 1968, Jackanory decided to try out an unpublished author who had submitted stories he'd written and illustrated for his own children.
John Grant was an architect from Edinburgh, but he wrote his stories, he illustrated them, and he told them with a very, very, very strong Scottish accent.
Neanderthal men had to be good spear throwers. Accurate spear throwing could mean the difference between supper for a hunter's family or supper for someone else's, like a saber-toothed tiger's.
Grant's character, Little Nose, was a cave boy who lived amongst long-nosed Neanderthals.
The simple idea behind Little Nose is that he's an outsider and a loner because, by their standards, he is almost horribly disfigured.
Unlike most Jackanory readers, Grant had no previous exposure to television production. At first, the experience was bewildering.
I couldn't get used to concentrating on what I was doing, ignoring the fact that there was a camera moving to a new position, that the floor manager was walking around for something else. And from time to time, I looked almost shifty, what's happening? But it seemed all right. And after that, I got asked back. Little Nose's ideas usually spelt trouble for someone, more often than not for Two Eyes. He sneaked away as Little Nose paced up and down, waving his arms as he explained his great idea. People nests, he said.
They were just very, very charming stories, just because he always got into trouble and parents were always chastising him and so on. But he was just a very endearing character, and John's illustrations were delightful.
The one thing he was now certain. Nests were so much trouble that anyone who preferred a nest to a good, solid floor must be positively bird-brained. Goodbye.
John Grant became one of the Jackanory studio's most frequent visitors. He delivered 55 episodes of Little Nose, and his stories were translated and sold around the world. By the mid-1970s, Jackanory was part of what became one of the golden eras of children's TV. Then, at the height of its popularity, the series regularly entertained audiences of 5.5 million. It had become a national institution, and Britain's leading film and TV stars were itching to appear on it.
I want to tell you about an emperor of long, long ago who loved pancakes.
This week's story is about London, though it could have happened in any big city, and about a boy who lived there called Ben Blewett.
To explain this change of fortune, we must now go back to when Reuben woke from his well-earned sleep.
Miss Belthorpe, who always dressed in autumnal shades of brown and did jigsaws in the evenings, had never had a good idea in her life.
All three darted through the gates and across the open space. The guards, still staring upwards open-mouthed, never saw them.
Nobody could believe their eyes when they saw the Iron Man marching behind the farmers. Where were they taking him? I'll tell you. Tomorrow. Goodbye.
And it became a sort of thing that the acting profession sort of ticked the box. People would say, "Have you done your Jackanory yet?" And it was a sort of accolade by the end.
Kenneth Williams is second only to Bernard Cribbins as Jackanory's most regular guest. He recorded a total of 69 episodes. Williams was a born raconteur. Jackanory was the perfect fit.
tea was more than just an ordinary afternoon sort of affair in the kingdom of Sip So Sweetly. It was positively a state function. Oh, yes, it was.
But the decision to invite Williams to perform on Jackanory was not uncontroversial.
On the radio, well, it was a radio program called Round the Horn, and Kenneth Williams and Hugh Paddock played two outrageous gentlemen called Jules and Sandy.
You want to make him big and butch. And be butch, you see, with the bulging biceps. Biceps.
Kenneth Williams' voice just fell totally into the slot. So I went to Anna Hume and I said, what about Kenneth Williams?
At first, the suggestion was greeted with alarm. Eventually, Williams was offered the chance to read, though he almost turned the offer down.
He came into my office and was looking very sour-faced. He said he wasn't very happy about this. And I said, oh dear me, that's getting things off to a very bad start. Well, what's the matter? And he said, well, it's about the Jackanory hat, you see. I said, what hat? He said, I've been told if I go on this programme, I've got to wear this great big hat that lights up and says Jackanory. I said, who told you that? He said, Hattie Jakes. That's this terrible story. But he did the show very well.
Get away, Hole Blackstick. I tell you, Master and Mrs. ain't at home to you. And he was going to slam the door, but the fairy with her wand prevented the door being shut.
The thing about Jackanory was that you couldn't see your audience. But Kenneth had the technicians. And the ladies and gentlemen in the studio just used to fall about at these extraordinary stories that he used to tell.
Yes, of course, stammered Cauliflower Charlie, thinking that Agaton Sachs was expecting Lispington and had jumped to the conclusion that the helicopter belonged to Scotland Yard.
He's got such an extraordinary energy about his face. I mean, his body seems to sort of hang there, virtually inert below it, and all the energy is sort of in here, in the neck and the mouth, and then suddenly this extraordinary variety of noises come out.
Oh, you ninny, you are so ignorant. You really are not fit for society.
Kenneth Williams was unbelievably funny and incredibly professional, and his diction was perfect. I remember worrying that maybe he was telling these stories a little too fast for the audience. So listening to it without the script and just seeing if I could follow what he was saying, it was impeccable. You could follow every word, no problem, whatever speed he was going at.
There was a hole in the side of the peach, quite a large hole. James knelt down in front of it and poked his head and shoulders inside. He crawled in. He kept on crawling. This isn't a hole, he thought excitedly. It's a tunnel.
Always one of Jackanory's stalwart supporters, Williams agreed to judge the programme's writing competitions for children. Thousands of budding authors entered in the hope of getting their stories read out on air.
When the 1975 story writing competition was announced, I immediately grasped this as my great opportunity to show what I could do, to do some writing which, who knows, may even win. And I used as my inspiration for the story an article that my dad had read out to us from his copy of The Guardian, and it was about somebody, one of those stories about somebody finding a relic or going into a junk shop and paying very little for something that turned out to be worth a lot of money, and that grabbed my imagination. And within a few weeks I'd had a letter saying that I'd won it.
His winning entry, entitled The Rag and Bone Man, was read by Kenneth Williams in December 1975. Sadly, the broadcast was wiped, but David made sure he had his own recording.
I remember vividly the day of the broadcast. I got my dad to borrow a portable tape recorder, and I held this thing up to the television, and I said, "You must be quiet, nobody make a sound."
What is it? Asked Arthur. It's one of your Egyptian mummies there, that is, replied the Rag and Bone Man. Oh, it's just what I want. How much?
Remember thinking vividly, he's not doing the right voices, because I heard Spike Milligan's voice or Harry Seacon's voice for all these characters, and I knew exactly how the line should be said. And he was doing all these other camp voices, and I didn't like it. I thought, no, that's wrong.
Blimey, said Arthur. It must be worth a fortune. The mummy opened its eyes and looked at Arthur and said, yes, I should think I am.
I was going to a Birmingham comprehensive school in the mid-1970s, and I was now linked with the campest man in England.
Eventually, David Benson overcame his embarrassment and became an actor and professional Kenneth Williams impersonator. He relives his Jackanory experience in his one-man show.
Everywhere I went, I had these great yobs coming up to me and going, Jackanory, Jackanory, all through the lunch hour, Jackanory, Jackanory, all through the football lesson. Even the football teacher was doing it eventually. I began to wish I'd never heard of the bloody programme.
It was the first time I realised that you could actually just sit down and out of thin air make up a story that would win a prize and would be listened to by children your own age all over the country. And I think maybe perhaps that was the beginnings of my real yearnings to be an actor or to perform or to be a writer or whatever. It was, I think really, it was a key turning point in my life.
Over the years, Jackanory became increasingly ambitious by introducing dramatic segments into its episodes. They were well received, so the series was commissioned to produce a spin-off series of studio-based plays. This new strand was called Jackanory Playhouse, and it ran throughout the winter months alongside traditional episodes of Jackanory, offering a range of output from modern dramas to classic fairy tales.
Good morning. And what have you for me today, Chancellor?
Oh, these, Excellency, the finished plans for your new bedroom and the first designs for the new ornamental garden.
The garden? Show me what you have in mind.
They were 25-minute productions, all done in a day in the studio. Absolute nightmare to do, I might say, because they were full of special effects, which of course were very difficult to do in those days. And there was a lot of transformation, a lot of costume changes, a lot of explosions and flashes and all sorts of things going on.
I think people trusted us to do more and more drama, and we got more money to do it, and it just grew. And I think it was, in essence, we proved that it was different ways of storytelling, and the children deserved the more elaborate form of storytelling, which would be proper drama, as much as they did the simple form.
The success of the Jackanory Playhouse sharpened the BBC's appetite for children's drama. The Jackanory team went on to produce more spin-offs by some of their favourite authors, including the writer of the Lizzie Dripping stories, Helen Cresswell.
There are no such things as witches.
That's all right, then. You come a little closer and I'll turn you into a toad.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to be rude.
Even more successful was Joan Edington's character, cheeky little Johnny Briggs. He made the leap from the Jackanory studio to become the star of several drama series of his own.
Yeah, what do you think you're doing?
Nothing.
Does it look like nothing to me?
It's only a library book, I rabbit.
Love your rabbits?
Let go, you'll get told.
Let go yourself.
In the early 1980s, Jackanory's dramas went from strength to strength, though nothing they did on stage would rival the impact of a traditional episode featuring a very special reader.
Prince Charles made his public debut as a storyteller this afternoon on the BBC programme Jackanory. He read his own story, The Old Man of Lochnagar, written 14 years ago for his younger brothers. It tells the tale of an old man's adventures around Balmoral.
Not all that long ago, when children were even smaller, and people had especially hairy knees, there lived an old man of Lochnagar.
He was very professional about it. And it was interesting because normally our job as directors was to make actors at ease. I mean, you want actors to be giving of their best and to feel comfortable. Well, he was doing that to us because the royal family is so used to making people who they're with, who obviously feel rather overawed, they're used to making them feel comfortable. So that's what he was doing. He was making us laugh and telling us stories about Prince William when he was charming. And he was very professional, did the retakes and took notes. So we got it done and all was fine.
It was then that he began to sneeze. He sneezed, and he sneezed, and he sneezed, achoo, until Finally, he sneezed so violently that the force directed him to the ground acted like a rocket and shot him up into the air.
Do you know who the man was telling the story?
Prince Charles.
Seen him before?
I liked all of it.
All of it? Which bits were best?
When he slipped on his bottom.
The appearance by Prince Charles gave the series a royal seal of approval, and the episode was loved by adults and children alike. Yet in its traditional form, Jackanory was already in decline. By the mid-1980s, Jackanory was competing against increasingly dynamic and interactive rivals.
You got a swat, have you? Yeah. Splendid.
To fight back, Jackanory tried to make their storytelling more ambitious. Martin Jarvis led the way by delivering a memorably adventurous adaptation of William at Christmas.
I just thought it would be interesting because of my particular interest in communicating the story and the pictures that I see in my head when I, as it were, midwife a character to the recipient, the children, the eavesdropping adults, or whoever who are watching, whether sometimes it's a jolt to cut away and have other pictures that might not be quite the pictures that the receiver, the audience the other end, are seeing in their own heads.
If only it had snowed, said Ginger. It's years since it snowed.
I had the idea that in telling the William stories, if we just had William's house, with all the things that might have been in, all the artifacts of a house of that period, that I could use as props. They woke up next morning to find the ground was thickly covered with snow. It meant quite a strong focus from me as a performer, in that it was like a live one-man show for 15 minutes, with no cutaways.
1, 2, 3, go, whispered William. And the startled colonel suddenly received from nowhere, as it seemed to him, a small hail of snowballs. They fell on his eyes and his ears, they filled his mouth, and they trickled down his neck.
Martin Jarvis had introduced a new level of sophistication to Jackanory's storytelling. But soon his innovations would be eclipsed by one of the most radical Jackanory storytellers ever.
I didn't like Jackanory very much at all. I loathed Jackanory, really. I'd done quite a lot of work in the BBC Children's Department. I'd been doing Play Away for about 1.5 years with Brian Cant.
Tony Robinson!
And because of that, I got a job in a Jackanory playhouse.
It's great to be alive!
And I was in the BBC Manchester bar one night, having drunk far more than I should have, and I was sounding off to the BBC producers how, as far as I was concerned, Jackanory wasn't really storytelling, because storytelling didn't rely on the rhythms of a book. They relied on the ordinary speaking rhythms that you told. So the BBC producers said, all right, then put your money where your mouth is.
In collaboration with the scriptwriter Richard Curtis, Robinson decided to adapt, write and perform a Greek legend in colloquial English.
He came to the edge of a huge wood by the side of a big cliff, and a load of peasants in big green hats came running up to him, and they said, "Oh, don't go any further, stranger. The great tosser lives in there. He'll toss you over the cliff."
I'd been looking at television shows like The A-Team and The Dukes of Hazzard, and I realised how closely they resembled the stories of the ancient heroes, and I felt that I could use, rather than sort of rather poncy language, I could use the language of today.
Suddenly, she heard footsteps, and she hid in the shadows. 3 soldiers came towards her. 2 had got enormous swords on, and 1 was carrying a large javelin. They stopped, and 1 said, "Nah, we missed her. Come on, let's try down by the harbour." And they ran off.
Influenced by the success of trendy youth television programmes, Jackanory filmed Robinson using handheld cameras. The technique suited perfectly his high-energy delivery, which they pushed to the limit.
The trademark of the thing was long takes, long continuous takes. I think we once did about 5.5 minutes of him just talking to camera and moving about purely from memory.
Hooray! Theseus has killed the pine bander! Theseus has killed the great tosser! Theseus has killed the great tosser's cousin!
I just had to explode onto the screen. It couldn't be small and sensitive and focused in that way. It had to be focused, but much more like dancing.
And they all lifted Theseus up onto their shoulders and carried him all the way to the gates of Athens.
I think what Tony Robinson brought to Jackanory was a sense of spontaneity and freshness in his storytelling, which is how all the great storytellers have worked. You have a story in your head and you just regurgitate it on the spot in your own words. So we really went right back to basics there.
Every morning Theseus would go out jogging with Hercules, and they'd jog round the boulder and they'd wrestle with a few mountain lions, jog back to the city and bash their heads against the brick walls and chuck javelins at sea eagles. Generally, you know, have a marvellous time.
You can see when Tony Robinson is telling the story that he's thinking on his feet. He's thinking, you know, well then at this point Hercules, he's got those little stutters, those little moments of indecision as he's thinking. Now that is ever so important. It sounds trivial, but that actually is part of the immediacy of a storyteller, because they're thinking and they're thinking about their audience at the same time.
After the success of Theseus the Hero, Robinson was commissioned to write a 13-part spin-off series based on another classical Greek hero, Odysseus.
One of the risks of putting on the Odyssey was that it could have been a very worthy exercise. You know, here you are, children, here's the classic that you must know and love. And the beauty of Tony's treatment was that he brought it completely up to date.
Sow the seed, sow the seed, sow the seed.
He gibbered. He's mad, said Eumaeus. Mad, said Menelaus. He's stark staring bonkers. I don't want a man like that in my army. Come on, let's get back to the mainland.
There was one great bit where Tony was telling the bit where Odysseus arrives back on land after his enormous adventure at sea. And all we got was the astonished look of all these people as this man barged his way through with a film crew.
They're coming to get him, he was shouting. They're coming to get Odysseus. They're coming to take him away. Who are? Asked Odysseus.
Of course I'm proud of Blackadder, of course I'm proud of Time Team, but in a way, Odysseus was one of the most innovative things that I've ever thought up.
In terms of energy and ambition, Tony Robinson's performance was a landmark in Jackanory history. But his achievement was soon to be matched when another comic actor, Rick Mayall, agreed to perform a Roald Dahl story entitled George's Marvellous Medicine.
George knew exactly what to do about that horrid old witchy woman. He would make her a new medicine, one that was so strong it would either cure her completely or blow off the top of her head.
Dahl was Jackanory's most popular author. Children loved his subversive stories, often featuring horrible adults who received their just desserts. Rick Mayall, who'd been entertaining audiences with his anarchic antics on the young ones, seemed the ideal match for Roald Dahl.
Now, the moment you bring people like Rick Mayall into a TV studio, you're asking for trouble. You know, mad things are going to happen, and if you can capture the madness and get it, then you've got dynamite. It's wonderful.
George had absolutely no doubts whatsoever about how he was going to make his famous medicine. He wasn't going to fool about wondering whether to put in a little bit of this or a little bit of that. Quite simply, he was going to put in everything he could find.
George's Marvellous Medicine caused a little bit more controversy than most.
There! On his mother's dressing table was yet another lovely aerosol can. Helga's hair set. Hold 12 inches away from the hair and spray lightly. Spray lightly. He squirted the whole lot into the saucepan.
He puts in cough medicine, paint, ink.
With his fingers, he scooped out the contents of a jar of vitamin-enriched face cream. In went a small bottle of nail varnish. If the toothpaste doesn't clean her teeth, George said, then this will paint them as red as roses.
It was the most popular week we ever did, and it had the most number of letters and phone calls. Complaints, of course, hundreds and hundreds of complaints from parents saying it was disrespectful to elderly ladies.
She had pale brown teeth and a small, puckered-up mouth, like a dog's bottom.
I got one from a very disgruntled lady whose children had used the plastic bath in their bathroom to put in every ingredient they could possibly find, including paint stripper. The bath had been completely wrecked and she'd had to have a new bathroom installed, and she wasn't at all pleased.
Now, Mrs. Elliott of Stanley, she phoned in to say, I wish the BBC would think before putting on such programmes.
Well, I have a 3-year-old son, and straight after the programme, he thought he could go and do the same thing.
I think George's Marvellous Medicine was very much on the cusp of pleasing kids and alienating adults. But I'm all for pleasing kids, and I don't really mind alienating the adults too much.
He put the cork back in the bottle. Medicine time, Grandma! And holding a spoon in one hand and the bottle in the other, he advanced into the living room.
I thought he was terrific. He was lively and jeeping, leaping about. And he was sparky, and the kids would have loved that. They'd love to see an adult in the first place, telling them a story, and also being rather silly.
Rick Mill was one of many presenters to bring Roald Dahl's books to life on Jackanory. 10 of his stories were adapted, including Matilda, Danny, Champion of the World, and Charlie and the Chocolate Factory.
Charlie picked it up and tore off the wrapper, and suddenly, from underneath the wrapper, there came a brilliant flash of gold.
Charlie hadn't moved. He felt quite dizzy. You could hear his heart thumping away loudly somewhere in his throat.
The great thing about Roald Dahl, it's almost as if he wrote Jackanory scripts, because Roald Dahl is one of the few authors who addresses the child directly in the text. So when the story reader reads Roald Dahl, it's almost as if they are Roald Dahl.
Mother! Yelled Charlie, rushing through the front door like a hurricane. It's the 5th golden ticket. I found it.
In 1990, Jackanory celebrated its 25th anniversary by commissioning a special series of stories from the most popular Jackanory writers, including Tony Robinson, Helen Cresswell and Joan Aiken.
Arabelle and Mortimer waited in the multi-storey car park. Mortimer liked watching the traffic and the huge planes that suddenly floated overhead coming down to land.
But by now the programme was in real trouble. Audiences had dwindled from their 1970s peak of 5.5 million to barely 2 million. The number of episodes was slashed. It was now given just a single 13-week run.
The viewing figures were dropping, and there was so much more that was going on that was faster. And there's a limit to how fast you could make Jackanory go. You can't, if you changed it radically, it wouldn't have been the same programme really. It just needed somebody else to come in and change it if it was going to survive. So I bowed out.
When I became producer, it was at a time when everything had speeded up, and it was actually very hard to think what one could do to retain the identity of Jackanory, which I suppose in comparison might seem more sedate. But it was certainly a programme which required the concentration of the audience. You couldn't just half watch it or half listen to Jackanory. You had to be with it. And I mean, it's fair enough, we have to admit that it's not everybody's cup of tea. If kids wanted something moving, talking fast, animated, loud, that wasn't the programme. However, having said that, I think in a balanced output, you need story, you need narrative, and you need things of light and shade.
In an attempt to revitalise the series, Romano rebranded Jackanory and drafted in some of Britain's brightest comic actors.
Common and vulgar. I've wasted a whole day on common and vulgar folk who I will not, are you listening, Henry, not have in my house.
You want to know why your spaghetti was squishy? Because it was worms!
As well as securing the services of Britain's top comedy talent, Romano capitalised on an explosion in children's literature by adapting gritty contemporary works, including novels like Thin Air by David Getz, about a young boy's struggle with asthma.
He sprang upright in his bed, trying to wake, gasping for air. He was wheezing and coughing. Not for the first time, he thought he was dying.
People have this idea that it's cosy and Jackanory. But actually, we've done stories about AIDS, we've done stories about homeless children, about brutality, about war, about refugees, as well as the classics. And we all know that there's nothing more scary than a Grimm's fairy tale.
Despite Romano's best efforts, the BBC was alarmed at the continued decline in Jackanory's viewing figures and decided to move the programme to an earlier slot. This decision caused problems when the programme broadcast The Iron Woman by the Poet Laureate Ted Hughes. Originally scheduled for a later slot, the BBC switchboard was jammed with complaints from parents whose children had been terrified by the story.
The Iron Woman raised her other foot. It came down and the ground leaped. Slowly, the vast shape began to dance there on the riverbank. As she danced, she sang in that awful voice.
Destroy the poisoners, the ignorant ones. Destroy the poisoners, the ignorant ones. The rubbishers destroy. The rubbishers destroy.
Undeterred by the controversy, Romano persuaded Hughes to write a series of stories especially for Jackanory. The result was The Dream Fighter and Other Creation Tales, which revealed how the animal kingdom came into being.
God did try to remake Camel, but it was no good. When the inside's wrong, the outside can never be right. He tried different tales, but all seemed wrong on Camel.
Salman Rushdie was also delighted when the producers adapted a collection of his short stories. He'd written Haroun and the Sea of Stories for his son, whilst in hiding to escape the threat from a fatwa.
The minutes passed. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Haroun lay stretched out on the back of But the Hoopoe, oblivious of time, oblivious of everything except his wish.
He wrote it when he was in self-exile, as it were, in captivity, after all the trouble with the satanic verses. But the wonderful thing about Haroun is that it is actually about storytelling. It is about the power of the word.
Move the whole moon by willpower? Mister, I thought, no problem.
Throughout the 30 years of its existence, Jackanory continued to reinvent itself. By the mid-90s, they'd introduced ambitious special effects in the hope of appealing to the modern child.
The innovations that the producers put in through the years are terribly important, because if you look at them across the time, if you go from that very first one, where all we've got is Lee Montague looking over his shoulder at someone in the other part of the studio turning round, and we've got a strange silhouette behind him. I mean, it's televisual, it is more than just a straight-to-camera story. And then we come right through to the end, and we've got people like Kathy Burke running about, a little bit of ad-libbing where they can, going into locations, coming out of them, some of them almost with the location being a comment on the story. That's terribly important, because you're experimenting with ways of telling a story, and I think television should do that.
I'm glad to see those monkeys are still upside down, said Mr. Twit. They're too stupid to do anything else, said Mrs. Twit. Let's go inside and load our lovely new guns, and then it'll be bang, bang, bang and bird pie for supper.
Despite the team's best efforts, viewing figures continued to decline. In 1996, just 3 months after the series had celebrated its 30th birthday, Jackanory was axed. To end the series, they recreated one of Jackanory's classic pairings, Alan Bennett reading Winnie the Pooh, a combination that they'd first brought together back in 1968.
I had no notion that the one I did was going to be the last one, or that it had any historic significance, as it were. And I suppose I ought to be very flattered.
Christopher Robin could just get his chin onto the top rail if he wanted to, but it was more fun to stand on the bottom rail so that he could lean right over and watch the river slipping slowly away beneath him.
When Alan Bennett did Winnie the Pooh, it seemed almost had a kind of timeless feel. It isn't timeless, but seems to sort of stretch back into something possibly Victorian, even though Winnie the Pooh is later than that. And it's a remarkable performance. I mean, the point at which they're playing poo sticks, and Eeyore comes past, and it's the question as to whether they're going to drop the stone. And he expresses Eeyore in a kind of slightly ratty, brummy voice.
Yes, said Eeyore. One of those would be just the thing. Thank you, Pooh.
And he's got Roo squeaking away in the background.
I didn't know you were playing, said Roo.
Poor old Winnie the Pooh trying to kind of figure it all out. I mean, it's a supreme performance, as we know that Alan Bennett can.
That's what I think, said Pooh, but I don't suppose I'm right, he said. Of course you are, said Christopher Robin. Goodbye. I would have thought that if you can get a tradition of storytelling going, you should stick to it through thick and thin. It is a work of education. I mean, obviously you have to interest the children, but at the same time you are educating them to listen to stories, and you are enlivening their imagination, and ratings have got nothing to do with it.
It would be very interesting to one day to take a number of children and see what you could do with the very simplest form of old-fashioned Jackanory approach, but just to see how that worked compared to the kind of multi-layered, multi-input programme which is supposed to be today the only way of communicating with children. Frankly, I don't believe it.
For more than 30 years, Jackanory introduced children to the magic of books. Its tea-time tales, delivered by Britain's biggest stars, educated, entertained and entranced. Jackanory was a space where children could use their imagination, escape from reality, and gain deep insights into the world around them.
To my mind, whether it necessarily increased reading, we'll never know. All you can say is that it increased awareness that these books and these stories were in the air.
I always did feel that I was a missionary in terms of children's literature, and that you were presenting for a new generation books that maybe children of today would not read because they're too long or they're too many words and too dense perhaps. So you're presenting it in a form they can accept.
It is about emotional education, and it's about intelligence about the world and about understanding how other people feel and what can happen to them. It doesn't always work, but we'd be tremendously impoverished if we didn't have it.
I was coming up to London to do a piece about Roald Dahl, and I picked up a taxi in Oxford Street, and the taxi driver was a black East End guy. He said, Bernie, in it? I said, yeah. Are you working? I said, yes, it's a story about Roald Dahl, and we're going to do... Oh, yeah, Roald Dahl, yeah. I said, with the jacket. He said, what? Jackanory? And I said, yeah. He said that he used to watch Jackanory as a kid, and it made him want to read. And he's not the only one, is he? I mean, there must be many, many more children who, because of that, having, oh, that's a good story, I'll read another one. And that was because of a very simple programme that the BBC were doing.
Goodbye. Goodbye. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Goodbye. Goodbye. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.